Ed is mic'd, so I'm just going to speak loudly for just a moment here. First of all, I want to give a big thank you to our Friends group. They are the ones who sponsor and provide all the funding for all of our adult programming at the Longmont Library. I wanted to make sure everybody knew that after the program, Ed's got books up here if you would like to purchase one, and I'm sure he will sign it and dedicate it to you in any lovely manner you would like. A couple housekeeping things. The room is warm. I'm sorry, we cannot change the temperature in here. It's set. It's government. And also just a reminder, turn off all phones and all things that go ring and beep and all that type of thing. Without further ado, let me introduce Ed Sealover.
Don't disappoint you. What I want to do is I want to just start out by reading one of my 400-word chapters. Don't worry, it's not that long. And then kind of launch you on a little talk about what this book is, how it came to be, and most importantly, the really incredible sites that are included in here and why I think they're so special to discuss. So, but to begin, I just want to read the chapter entitled Silverton. The town of Silverton blew up in the 1870s after the U.S. government pushed the Utes off the surrounding land and pent-up prospectors rushed in to seek gold and silver. While other towns boomed, busted, and disappeared, Silverton was home to precious metal activities for 120 years, enough to keep it alive, but never enough after World War I to provide the secluded town with sufficient sufficient economic activity to revitalize. Thus, according to local historian Beverly Rich, the town has the highest concentration of pre-World War I architecture in the United States. It's not just Victorian-era buildings that make this small downtown area a mandatory historic stroll, though. Buildings on the notorious Blair Street, home to 32 bordellos, saloons, and casinos, have been preserved or rebuilt. Brothels were so ingrained in the city's culture that the last lady of the evening left town in 1949, meaning that the Nazis were vanquished before Silverton was prostitute-free. Silverton also has one of the most unique mining-era structures in the United States, the Mayflower Mill. While gold mine tours are common throughout the country, gold processing mill tours are rare, and many that exist have reproduction equipment. The Mayflower, however, shut down in 1991 after 63 years of operation. Owners locked the door and left the equipment inside. Their loss is your gain. The mill was the last built to handle the bounty coming out of nearby Arostra Gulch. It processed 9.8 million tons of crude ore for gold, silver, and base metals, reaching a height of 1,200 tons per day. It also was an environmental pioneer, creating some of the first ponds for the safe disposal of mine tailings, the mounds of which can be seen just west of the mill. Visitors on self-guided tours can see the machines that were part of the process, from a bucket tram that delivered ore, to the crusher plant that pulverized it, to the flotation areas where precious metals rose to the top. A half dozen machines still work with the push of a button. Harrowing pictures show miners riding trams across the valley, and a bin still holds 800 tons of crushed ore, putting you briefly back into the boomtown era. Silverton's 625 residents rely on tourism rather than natural resources these days. Yet the newly quaint charm leaves you torn between enjoying the peace and wanting to step back to a much rowdier time. I've been living in Colorado for 15 years when I decided to undertake Colorado Excursions with History Hikes and Hops in early 2015. I knew I wanted to do two things with this book. I wanted to tell about the adventures that I'd had during the time, and I wanted to scour the state as well, to find the gems that I still hadn't been able to get to in my time here. Silverton, as it turned out, was a little bit of both. In writing my first book in 2011, Mountain Brew, A Guide to Colorado's Breweries, I discovered Silverton while visiting its brewery, but I hadn't been to the Mayflower Mill before my excursions in 2015, and I left absolutely floored at what it had to offer. So what this is then is a love letter, both to my adopted home state and to the friends and family who had helped me to explore it. And it's a letter that I hope will inspire you all and everyone who reads this, not just to follow the paths that I did and find these great sites, but to seek out your own paths and to find things beyond what I'd even imagined seeing. So the first thing you may ask is, okay, who the heck are you? Well, I'm a newspaper reporter by trade. I moved here in late 2000 from South Carolina to cover City Hall for the Colorado Springs Gazette. And by passion and fascination, though, I'm a history buff and I'm a beer geek. And I'm an outdoor enthusiast. So I spent my weekends exploring. I went to the normal places you explore Colorado Springs, like Garden of the Gods. But I also went to unusual places like the Museum of Colorado Prisons, which I'll come back to later in this lecture. And it wasn't that I wasn't writing then. I was. I just wasn't writing about fun stuff like this. I graduated from Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. I spent 2 years in Fort Smith, Arkansas, 3 years in Anderson, South Carolina, and finally got the chance to come here in 2000. I moved here because I had a friend who lived in Denver, and I thought it'd be nice to be near a friend if I'm starting over. Luckily, 5.5 years later, that friend became my wife, Denise, and my partner in the travels that we have laid out in this book. Now, I like to think I did some good work at the Gazette, but the most important thing I ever did during the time I was covering City Hall and politics was to convince my entertainment editor in 2003 that we needed a beer column at the paper. That's how I really got into writing about beer. That's it in the lower left corner there, a little thing called Beer Run that I ran until I left Colorado Springs in 2008. That led to a blog that I still have up called Beer Run Blog. It kept going until I moved up here to Denver. I took a job at the Rocky Mountain News in 2008, thinking, great, that's going to be the last job of my life. I know this is a good crowd when that's a laugh line. So of course, then you probably know the story. I get there, 7.5 months later, the paper shuts down. The good thing about it while we were getting in the process of getting shut down, I was trying to think of what on earth I was going to do with my life. And I threw a number of ideas out there, but it's how I finally came up with the idea for my first book, Mountain Brew, A Guide to Colorado's Breweries. In fact, it was really conceived while I was at a beer festival one day with friends. So I like to say, like all great works of literature, my muse were the twin, I was inspired by the twin muses of desperation and inebriation. Mountain Brew was a great activity. I spent 2.5 years driving around the state, visiting every brewery that was open in the state then. And that came out in 2011. That was 101 breweries. Just for perspective, there's about 350 now. That's less than 7 years later. So that tells you where the state boom has gone. Mountain Brew led to an opportunity to do a TV show, a very, very short-run TV show in the upper right-hand corner there called Colorado Brews. Did anybody see that? I usually don't get any hands for this one. We put up one episode as a pilot on Rocky Mountain PBS. It was going to be driving around the state, visiting breweries, talking about how neat they were. And we got the okay to do an entire season after that. And so my producer and I filmed 13 episodes. I kept asking him when they were coming. He kept saying, oh, I'm working on them. Finally, he stopped returning my phone calls. And so somewhere out there are 13 episodes sitting unedited on somebody's computer. But I can promise you, it would have been a good show had it lasted. Anyway, after that fizzled, it got me back thinking, okay, I need to do a second book here. But what do I really want to do? I've already done the beer book. And then I reached back to my first book when I had interviewed every brewer in the state at that point. And I recalled the story that two of my favorite brewers, Adam Avery of Avery Brewing and Brian Dunn of Great Divide Brewing, told me. And if you know beer, you probably know both of those are some of the most successful brewers in the country right now. Well, when they opened in the mid-1990s, both of them struggled wildly. And they said the reason they struggled was because they were making the beers everybody else was making and drinking. And then in almost fits of desperation, they decided, oh, the heck with it. I'm going to make what I drink, even if nobody else is drinking this. For Adam Avery, that was a hugely hopped barley wine. For Brian Dunn at Great Divide, that was a then unheard of 8.7% alcohol by volume English Old Ale. Suddenly, people were drinking both of them. They were selling like crazy, and these guys were off to the careers that have now taken them on to national fame. So I thought, okay, what do I love? I love hiking outdoors, I love going to local craft breweries, and I love history. And I figured, you know what? Not everybody is going to love those three things. But not only do I think I can hit 2 out of 3 with most people, but I also thought this is really what defines Colorado. Because what is this state if it's not for our rugged frontier past, for our incredible scenery, and for our craft spirit that's gone beyond the breweries into our distilleries, our wineries, our food scene now, and really makes us stand unique. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. And my goal was to do a book that encompassed visiting all 3 of these sites. And I started kind of dawdling around in early 2015. My wife and I started going to sites with our little son. And then she came to me in May of 2015 and announced that our daughter was on the way come January 2016. So then I had a deadline. And then the trick was, how do I pick the location? So first, we laid out a map of the state, about everything we could find there. And in case that map doesn't look familiar, that's the Beer Drinker's Guide to Colorado map, because that's how we roll in our house. We probably picked about 60 types of historic, natural, and drinking sites to go visit. Then I decided, okay, how do I tell this story? And I really like the idea of 30 days of traveling around the state, stopping each day at one historic site, one natural site, and one drinking site. And that's what the book is. Now, my publisher came to me and said, hey, Ed, it's not 1910. People don't take 30-day trips anymore. How about you organize this a little better? And so I came up with 10 3-day road trips. So you can go for a long weekend or a short week and try to keep things in proximity to each other for people to visit. He also said something very important to me. He said, you wrote the brewery book, so I don't want you writing about 30 breweries. And sure enough, I still do have 17 breweries in this book. But I also have 2 wineries, 2 distilleries, 4 historic bars, 3 local bars, 3 beer bars, 1 wine bar, and 1 craft beer resort. Then it was to figure out exactly what goes in and how to tell this story. So I figured that I started with what I call the no-duh locations, the places that anybody is going to go visit when you come to Colorado, a place like Rocky Mountain National Park, or a place like Mesa Verde. But I couldn't just retell the story, or else my book is no good at doing anything different that's on the market now. So for each of these places, I try to put in something different. For example, when I send people down to Mesa Verde, which is probably my single favorite spot in all of Colorado to visit, I don't want you to just meander through the cliff dwellings and try to imagine what made these people dive into the cliffs and then to leave less than 100 years later. I also want you to go hiking on a place like Knife Edge Trail. A trail up there is in the northwest corner of the park. It's about a 2-mile in and out, so it's pretty easy. But along the way, there are 32 different plants marked that show everything from what the ancestral Puebloans used for medicine, to thatch their roofs, to dye their clothes, and it gives you this incredible sense of what it was like to live at that time in this rugged condition, trying to meld these things together. And so I thought, this is a way to tell people about what they may already know, but not know the whole story. I included no-duh locations like the Great Sand Dunes. I don't think you come to this state and travel around a lot without wanting to climb up those. But the trick, I thought, was that everybody knows how to climb up the sand dunes. I'd like to write a little bit as well about how to get down. If the path up is tough but rewarding, the return trip downhill is more an excuse for childlike adventure. Some visitors barrel down in kayaks or sandboards that they've rented outside the park and hauled to the top. Those without equipment have the option of walking down, leaping from point to point, or rolling shoulder over shoulder down the open slopes, stopping only when the world is spinning at too fast a pace. The latter option is highly recommended. And then, there are also those no-duh locations if you're a beer fan. I figure if you're going to come to Colorado, you're going to go drink at Odell Brewing. But I wanted to make sure to tell people, okay, it's not just about the beers you know there. It's also about how these folks have been such a big part of the community that no tips that you leave them actually go to the staff. They all go to charities, that they've become involved in much of Fort Collins' social fabric, and that they basically donated the brewery on which Colorado State University students brew on each year, including brewing in Odell each year when the class is ending as well. Those are the kind of things I want people to know, although I did also make sure to tell them to try their Freak, which is their combination of 3 barrel-aged creeks put together. And so I went through the places you know. Then I wanted to sprinkle in the places that tell the story of a place. And I realize I said place like 4 times in the last 10 seconds, so I'm sorry about that. But the story of a place is told in a location like Palisade. I picked Palisade because this is the only place in Colorado where on the same block you can find a brewery, a winery, and a distillery. Actually, 2 wineries on the same block. So you could go there all day and never have to leave the same block. But it really tells the story, too, how the town grew from a wine-making town into a place where everybody is coming and trying out their wares and really growing in Colorado's spirit, even at a place like Palisade Brewing, which the owner describes to me as kind of a haven. He sees people coming in who are just glossy-eyed from so much wine drinking and loving the idea of having a beer for lunch. You can tour some incredible places in Colorado, and people know a lot of them, but I like to tell the story of a place like Mount Falcon Park. This is my favorite place to go hiking near my home in Jefferson County. It's not just a wonderful collection of 11 miles of trails. It's a place where you can see the ruin of John Brisbane Walker's home there, a place that burned down in 1918 and still stands as a monument overlooking it. And it's the same park where they were planning to build the summer White House. There was actually, in 1916, a collection started to put up a place where the presidents could come out in the summer and rest away from the heat of Washington, D.C. This is a drive that got scuttled by our entry into World War I and never got going again, but you can still see the cornerstone of that summer White House that's built in the back of a trail there. And then I like to tell the story of a place like Lady Falkenberg's in Durango. In sending people to Durango, and I have 2 full days of activities in Durango in the book, I of course send them to Ska Brewing. I mean, it's a wonderful place. But I thought for the second day, I don't want to just send them to another brewery. Lady Falkenberg's is a bar that is very literally underground. You're walking down the stairs into the bar. It's completely below ground, just off of downtown. It's a place where the original owners painted these wonderful murals on the wall that are completely made up of the faces of their friends. It's a place that has a wall of bricks there where if you drink 100 beers, not in one setting, you can get anything you want on the bricks there. The new owner tells me that some people just come in locally and they get their name up there eventually. Some people come back maybe once a year for business and they keep track of everything they drank so they can get their brick. And it's a place that has 38 craft beers on tap as well in a very out-of-the-way location. And I love the spirit of that. That tells me a lot about Colorado. After that, though, I decided I want to tell the stories as well that surprise people. Not just the people who are coming to this state, but the people who live here and may not know about everything in it. Places like Deerfield. And I know, a lot of people look at that slide and say, wow, Ed, that looks fun. Deerfield is an old farming colony. It's about 34 miles east of Greeley. And what you're looking at there is all that's left there. There's about 4 or 5 remnants of buildings and a couple of historical markers that stand there. But Deerfield is one of my favorite stories, and I think it tells a lot about Colorado. It was an African-American farming colony that was started in 1910 by a couple of Denver black businessmen who wanted a place for the black community in Denver to go at the time when racism was really just starting to pick up in Denver. They came out the first winter. There were only 7 families that came out, and only 2 of them had a permanent structure. But the town grew from there, and over that decade, after 1910, it became prosperous. Hundreds of families moved up here, and for those that didn't move up here, it actually became a social center on weekends of the African-American community that would take the train up from Denver for dances and get-togethers up there because it was such a popular place. If you've been out there, and maybe you can tell from this picture, this is not easy farming land. This is dry land farming, but they prospered. It grew throughout the 1910s. Like many of the farming colonies that started up, especially in the Eastern Plains, it collapsed after World War I. 2 things had happened. Crop prices that had gone up so much for World War I quickly de-escalated after the war, and people who had borrowed and mortgaged their lives to continue growing found themselves losing their farms to the banks. And the weather also in the 1920s turned a lot drier than it did the decade before. Eventually, this town went away, leaving all that you see there. But the Museum of the Black American West in Denver is working to get markers out there to rebuild some of these structures and to tell this story. Because to me, it really is a story of Colorado being a utopian place. Not just a place that we come because we happen to be here, but because so many people came here looking for a new start. And Deerfield, to me, is one of the ultimate examples of it. And you can really feel it by getting out there. I tell stories that people don't know too, maybe like the Alfred Packer Massacre Trail. I will tell you, Denise and I had several arguments about what should be in the book and what shouldn't. She kept trying to tell me Lake City should not be in the book. Lake City is the most remote city in the lower 48 states. It's about 3.5 hours northeast of Durango, a couple of hours south of Gunnison. But the story to me is incredible. This is the place where Alfred Packer, the man now known as America's favorite cannibal, led a group of miners, a group of prospectors, in the winter of 1874, led them to a plateau where, depending on which story you believe, he either killed and then ate them or just happened to eat them after they all died. And going there is really part of the fascination for me. First of all, the sign you see there, the Alfred Packer Massacre site, is where the graves of the 5 men who were found dead there are buried now. It's on this very lonely plateau that even in this day and age, you can understand why somebody, especially in the dead of winter in a snowstorm, would get lost there and have no way to get out. So you can feel the loneliness there. But also if you go into Lake City, you can go into town, see the Historical Museum, which has things like Alfred Packer's shackles from his time in jail, as well as the dollhouse that he built while he was in the state penitentiary in Canyon City. And then you can go to the local courthouse, which is still the oldest still functioning courthouse in Colorado. And you can see on the wall the judge's verdict. Now this is often, if you know anything about the Packer trial, this is actually one of the most misquoted pieces of history in Colorado. A lot of people describe the judge as ranting Yosemite Sam style and saying, there are only 7 Democrats in Hinsdale County and you ate 5 of them. Actually, the judge gives this extremely eloquent speech about you took their trust and you violated it in the most sacred way possible. And for that, I'm sentencing you to hang. The trick is, apparently, a newspaper reporter who didn't go to the trial heard about the verdict while he was sitting in a bar and wrote that up. And that has been passed down through lore through us. So every once in a while, I like to set the record straight as well. Oh yes, there's one more, I should say, in the stories of surprise that I like to bring up, and that's a place called Walter's Brewery. When I was driving around Pueblo, it was one of the cities where I went into saying, Pueblo's got to have a drinking site here. It was once the city with more bars per capita in America than any city of its size. But I didn't quite know what it should be. And I almost stumbled, not literally, I mean, like I just kind of accidentally found Walter's, which is a brewery that existed from the late 19th century up until 1975 in Pueblo. And it was one of the last American breweries that still existed before the takeover of big beer in the late 70s and early 80s, that was revived just a few years ago by a brother and sister who went to the family and said, we want to start this back up. We want to use your original recipes. And not only that, they put it in an 1883 rail depot that used to belong to J.M. Lemp's brewery down there. And so it has this incredible feel of not only history in it, but almost a speakeasy type thing. Because when you go in, you have to go through a door and through another door and get to the back room to find the brewery. But when you do, the owners just may give you a tour. They may tell you about the ghosts there. It's just a wonderful piece of history wrapped up in brewing as well. Finally, the last stories that I decided I had to tell in this book are the stories that go beyond any description I could easily give you, but that are magical places that I found. One of them is a place called Zapata Falls. Zapata Falls is just a few miles away from Great Sand Dunes, and I had read about it when I went on my tour. And so I started hiking back there, and it's a really unremarkable half-mile hike in, and you kind of meander along, and you think to yourself, why on earth would anybody be going back here? And you get into this grotto, and suddenly you start crossing the river over and back, because there's just, I shouldn't say river, it's just a little stream that you're crossing over and back, and you realize you're just going to have to get your feet wet, and it's part of the joy of it. And you end up inside this incredible cavernous area where the waterfall is coming down right in front of you, very literally. You're standing there, you can barely hear yourself talking to somebody. Some people are climbing up those rocks to stand underneath the waterfall, others are just staring at it in majesty. And it was one of the more surreal moments I had in researching this book, of feeling like I'm in a place that I've never been before. And that's the kind of joy I want to inspire in people when they find Colorado. Also, strange personal favorites like the Colorado Museum of Prisons. This is another one that my wife tried to tell me to keep out of it. But I said, no. This is Colorado history right here. Because what was Colorado when it was settled as basically a gold rush state, more than a lawless area? There are 11 prisons in Canyon City right now. And when this particular structure, the women's prison, was closing in 1968, they decided, let's save it as a museum. Let's tell the story of our penal system. The brash sheriffs, the crazy criminals, the really tough stuff that went on there, from riots to, they actually have a whole desk full of all the contraband, shanks, and guns and weapons people snuck in there. And you get this incredible sense of what it was like for two reasons. One, if you can see that picture in the upper right-hand corner there's a wall in the background. That's not just a cute little wall. That separates the museum from a medium security prison. So you're right in it still. And secondly, if all of these cells and stories don't resonate with you, you can just stare right into the actual gas chamber that ended 8 people's lives during this time. It's quite a reminder of our history, even the history that's not pretty to talk about. And finally, the last place that I just was struck in ways that I can't describe, but I try in the book, was John Martin Reservoir, which is about 19 miles outside of Los Alamos, which is way away from anything to begin with. And this is one of the top 25 birding sites in the interior United States. It's an amazing collection of 373 birds that come through there every year. Some of them extremely rare, some of them coming through only to nest and reproduce and move on. And going down to John Martin Reservoir, is a step away from the hustle of life like I've never seen. And you sit there in the campground underneath the tree just listening to the warbling of birds, or you stand out on one of the points looking over the reservoir itself, seeing life fly by. And it's really, in a book where I spent a lot of time over those 30 days of natural sites sending people hiking, or maybe sending you rafting, or doing some backcountry driving, going to a bird sanctuary was one of my favorite things I was able to include in there to show just how diverse Colorado's beauty is. So those are how I came together on it. The last thing I'll say is I wanted to make sure this is a book for the whole family. I mean, certainly you could have put 30 days worth of climbing 14ers in here. That would have eliminated a lot of people's ability to do this. I want this to be a place where everybody can go, whether you're new to the state, whether you've lived here, whether you're in good shape or whatnot. In fact, the only 14er I have in here is Pikes Peak, and I talk mostly about riding the train up there, so you can really enjoy the views from up there. I also wanted to make sure there was nothing death-defying in here. I mentioned that I had put some whitewater rafting in here. Well, it's Browns Canyon, and just to tell you how non-death-defying it was, about 12 years ago, I was rafting through the Royal Gorge with friends when I fell out over Sunshine Falls. Okay, there's a couple ones there that understand. Sunshine Falls, depending on the year, is either Class 4 or Class 5 rapids. I floated along the river for quite a long time. By the time they pulled me out, they said my lips were turning blue. And I had said, that's it. I'm not going back on the river again. I've had my fun with that. But just to prove that people can do anything in here, I said, I'm going to get over my fear. And in 2015, I jumped back in a raft with a family that I didn't know. They were nice to accommodate me, and that's actually me on the back of the raft there, just to prove how wonderful it can be to do this, and that anybody can get through a place like Browns Canyon that has a couple of rapids, but certainly nothing death-defying that explains Colorado's beauty. The other thing I wanted to make sure was that this was very family-friendly, and I mentioned that we have 2 children now. My son was about 11 months old for lots of this. And so he came hiking with me. None of these hikes are things you can't take a kid in a backpack on. Funny story, going through the Black Canyon of the Gunnison with him that day. On the way out, people were waving at him, saying how cute he was. On the way back, they were just staring at me like, and I couldn't understand why. I get back to the visitor center where my pregnant wife was resting, and the kid slumped over like this. I thought, oh no, I've killed my son researching this book. But he was just so pleasantly lulled to sleep. He just fell asleep on me. I think it's a wonderful time to be sleeping on a hike. And on the other end of things, I not only take him hiking, but I take him into one of the swankiest wine bars in all of Colorado as well, in Aspen, because if you're going to be drinking in Aspen, you might as well drink in a swanky wine bar. And they were perfectly happy to have him cavorting around the pool with all the European sunbathers. So what did I learn in all of this? And I think that's the important thing to come out of here. I learned that Colorado had a lot more historical value than even a 15-year resident like myself and a native like my wife had to know. I found that out in traveling to parts of the state I'd never been to before, like southeast Colorado, to see a day that I just call, I doubled up in historical sites, I call Colorado's Darkest Hours. On one part of it, you have Camp Amache, which was a Japanese internment camp during World War II that held 10,000 Japanese prisoners over the 3.5 years it operated in a 1 square mile area surrounded by barbed wire and guards who stood in those towers toting guns. It was an incredible place to visit, and it was an incredible place to visit because I was shocked at the hope I found there. Camp Amache was something that faded into Colorado's history until a man named John Hopper took a job as the social studies teacher at very, very tiny Granada High School. Granada is a town of about 4 blocks. And told his first students in 1990 that they had to research the history of Camp Amache. Ever since then, each class added on to it. They've become very familiar with the survivors and the descendants of this camp. They've started a museum in downtown that has not only the tough memories, but the good ones. This was a place that had a for-profit print screening shop in it. It was a place that had a high school. It was literally the 10th largest city in Colorado during World War II. And the local high school beat Holly High in football one year, and they still think about it. This is a place that had 31 people who were forced out of their homes into this internment camp, not just volunteer for the Army, but win accommodations and medals during World War II. And to see that, and the hope they have in rebuilding this to tell the story, to make sure that this is not forgotten in our history, is incredible. The same day, and yeah, this is a depressing day in the book, I send people to the Sand Creek Massacre site as well. This is an entirely different field, quite frankly, than Camp Amache. This is a place where a largely drunken regiment of soldiers in 1864 massacred mostly women, children, and elderly men from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. An incident that became the most investigated incident of the entire Civil War. But today, that's what you see when you go there. This is sacred land to those tribes, and there's no monuments built on it. There's monuments nearby. There's storyboards explaining what happened. But it's just a place that you look out and contemplate the depth that the human soul can dive into at times. And I really think that as much as that may not sound like the place that you want to pack your family up and take them to, these are important memories for us to remember in Colorado so we don't repeat them. I learned the beauty in the state is in the places you don't always go looking for it. This is Mount Margaret Trail up in Fort Collins. And actually, when I was researching Fort Collins, I said to a friend of mine, where do you want to take me hiking? She said, I got this great trail where we actually start at a higher point than we end. It's 8 miles round trip. And I said, that doesn't sound fun. But it is. You're a 4-mile hike through all kinds of lakes, grasslands. You go past literal cattle that are just staring at you on the trail, and you end up in a scene like that that's as beautiful as any of the peaks you're going to climb up to. You just happen to lose a couple of 100 feet going to it. And it really stood out to me as the kind of wacky, oddball things that are still so beautiful in this state. And I learned that the craft beer culture has produced gems beyond anything you can taste in the bottles. This is Bristol Brewing in Colorado Springs, which is really the first place I learned to drink here in Colorado when I moved out. They're one of the pioneer breweries in Colorado Springs, but much more importantly, in 2009, that Ivy Wild school area there was closing down. This is a part of the city that is kind of fallen on economic hard times. They were going to close it. There was worries that they were going to bulldoze this school. And the owner of the brewery, Mike Bristol, said, no, I'm not going to let that happen. Got a group of investors together, bought the school, moved the brewery into it. So you literally now can sit in the brewery overlooking, areas of classrooms. He says former teachers come there and say how much they actually enjoy it more now that there's a brewery. But it's not just a brewery. There's also a coffee shop. There's a meat selling shop. There's a community center where people from the community get together for concerts or other events. It's a wonderful example of how breweries are going well beyond making beer and really, making the social fabric of their community. And I love to tell stories like that. I also learned that I have a lot more to learn. I have gone down a lot of roads in researching this book, but I haven't seen every great historic mining cabin. I haven't seen every early settlement site. I haven't seen every beautiful backwater waterfall out there. And I really want people who read this book to take it, to visit these sites, and then to put it aside and go visit something they've never heard of in that area. And then to tell me how beautiful they are, because this is what we're doing in this state. We are living in its beauty. We are living in the spirit that we've all created here. And the more that we can build from it, that's what I really want to see from this. And so I'm just going to finish by reading one final chapter here. This is my favorite out-of-the-way brewery in Colorado. This is Three Barrel Brewing in Del Norte. When people drop into Three Barrel Brewing, owner John Bricker asks if they'd like a pizza with their beer. It's a far cry from the brewery's early days when he'd inquire whether they wanted to renew their home insurance policy while they were drinking in his office. In a town that has more buffalo herds, 2, than stoplights, 1, you do some unusual things to grow a brewery. For Bricker, that meant making beer in the space in the back of his insurance office for 8 years after opening in 2005. He eventually put in a bar next door to the agency before going for broke and establishing this 62-seat pizza restaurant in November 2014. Travelers heading from Alamosa, west from Alamosa, or east from Durango and Pagosa Springs along Highway 60 make up most of the customers for Three Barrel, as Del Norte's population totals out fewer than 1,700. And its 2 best sellers, Trashy Blonde and Hop Trash IPA, are the kinds of relatable ales that motorists of all sorts can enjoy over lunch or dinner. But the success of Three Barrel, which has outgrown its originally appropriate name and now brews on a 15-barrel system, is linked more to the sour offerings Bricker dreams up, ranging from classically Brettanomyces fermented tart beers to experiments that use the likes of Asian pepper or beet sugar. These are sought after in liquor stores and beer bars around the state, and they have ensured that what was once a pseudo-secret brewery has become more well-known than its hometown. Bricker is a herald for the San Luis Valley, however, a humble man who embraces and seeks to promote his home area and the reputation of Three Barrel grows. Barley that is grown and malted nearby is a key ingredient, and the brewery's labels, heavy with images of early area settlers, are done by a local artist. And the question-evoking names of the beers often relate back to local stories, from the Dilly Incident, which is an adventure of a local buffalo-rearing family, to Bad Phil, which is about a neighbor's surly rooster. Del Norte may be a spell away from pretty much everywhere. It's 30 miles northwest of Alamosa. But living and brewing there offers an advantageous lifestyle that compelled Bricker's daughter and son-in-law to leave Denver jobs to help him run the business. Quote, "We want to grow about to the point where it's starting not to be fun as much as it is work, and then we want to plateau," said Will Crutzer, that son-in-law. "We're just having fun." And that's John with my family there. So that's my book story. And now I want to open it up for questions. And I realize I always do this. I go through the speech and I realize there's one part I forgot. I think I forgot to mention, I'm actually, after the Rocky closed, I did find another job. I'm a reporter for the Denver Business Journal, and I cover the brewing industry as well as a host of other beats from state government to healthcare. So I was able to land on my feet, but still, maybe the best thing that came out of its closing was it made me get into the book writing business. So. That said, what did I not mention, or what did I really confuse people about, or what do you want to tell me about that I didn't include up here yet? that? What can we chat about? Yes?
What's the craft beer resort?
The Craft Beer Resort is what used to be the Vail Cascade. It just rebranded into the Hotel Talisa, and it's a resort in Vail where the owner went to, he had a craft beer consultant working for him, a woman named Laura Lodge, who runs the Big Beers, Belgians, and Barley Wines Festival each year. It's now in Breckenridge. And he said, I want to capitalize on this beer drinking thing. What can you do? And she literally crafted this menu where they have 40 different beers, either on tap or in their cellar there, and they have a restaurant that pairs beers with everything they do. And it's just, I love the spirit of it because it's a different place. I mean, if you go into ski resorts, most of them are, wine-driven places that don't reflect Colorado's, at least its culinary, at least its wine and beer drinking spirit. And she said, no, we're going to do this. We're going to do this to make sure people know they're in Colorado. And so it was a unique place, and I figure if I'm sending people to drink in Vail, that's where they got to go. Yes, sir.
What's your next project?
Well, I think I've technically just come out of timeout. As I mentioned, my daughter Jane was born 13 days after I turned this book into my publisher in January 2016. And while I've been doing a lot of these speaking gigs, I promised my wife that I would wait until the end of 2017 to even think about my next project. So I guess I'm free of that now. And I haven't decided on it yet, and I'm probably not going to move forward for at least another year. But it's something that's a little even more historically driven. I want to do a lot on historical tourism and just getting people to really unique sites and to find out where our history happened here. So probably focus on that. All right, I can't read that.
Repeat the questions.
Oh, repeat the questions. Thank you. I'm sorry. He asked what my next project was, and he asked the craft beer resort. All right, who's next? Yes, ma'am.
What about that water tower in Rangeley where they're doing these really wild acoustic concerts? Have you?
Oh, yeah.
I have not been there. I know the one you're talking about, and I've read about it. And that's the tough part, is that there were a lot of things I wanted to include in this book that I didn't. And I don't know that one made the short list necessarily, but it's the great thing and the hard thing about Colorado is you narrow this down to 95 places, because I double and triple up some of these days here. And you don't include things. I had, for example, I really, when I set out, I said I've got to have the Ludlow Massacre site in this book. And I didn't end up putting it in because it would have been in the same 3-day road trip that included the Sand Creek site and Camp Amachi, and I thought, this is too much. Okay, we've got to do something peppier and lighter somewhere in here. Or I really wanted to throw Steamboat Springs in here, and it was just not on any of the trips. So it's, there's a lot more I'd love to put in here. It was a matter of numbers. Yes, sir.
From beginning to end, how long did the book take you?
Beginning to end, how long did the book take? It took, I started kicking this one around in, probably the idea started kicking around in late 2014. When we were on a trip, we started brainstorming about what I could include if this was where I was going to go. And my first book, we spent 2 years touring the state and lollygagged around to make sure we talked to every one of the brewers in the state at the time. This one, like I said, was probably going to be the same thing, at least a year or so. But once I found out that Denise was pregnant, which came in May, I decided I had to get this done by January. So it was 8 months of travel. We took 2 7-day trips, and we tried to approximate what I asked people to do in this book because, I had obviously, some of these things you don't go for a day. Rocky Mountain National Park is in here as one part of a 3-stop day. You don't spend a third of a day in Rocky Mountain National Park, but for some of these, I wanted to make sure that these are legitimate trips we could go on. So we spent some intense week-long trips over the summer doing this. I spent some time myself over the summer and then traveled around in the fall too. But by October, I was sitting down writing this, and by January, it was in. So it was probably the quickest turnaround, less than a year of real work for a book like this. Yes, sir.
What was your most favorite and least favorite brewery?
My most favorite and least favorite brewery? You know, it's a tough question because the answer always bores people. My favorite brewery is Great Divide Brewing in Denver, which everybody knows about. But I think they do the most incredible range of stuff. I love the owner and the staff down there. They're always mixing up and trying new things. But the one I often refer to as the favorite that I'll talk about was Three Barrel. I mean, there is no place I like stopping in this state better. Incredible, nice people, good host there, and just one of those things you just don't believe you've stopped at. Like, yeah, I'm in the middle of nowhere, and this guy's making up Britannomyces Belgian Bière de Gardes. Yeah, it was that's great. And as far as my least favorite brewery, I'm going to delicately avoid that question and just say it's not in the book. There's nothing in this book that I would not recommend visiting. No. Oh, yes, ma'am.
What do you have up in kind of the northwest corner of the state, or is that not really included?
It's funny that you asked that because somebody asked when I was standing back there earlier if this takes in the entire state, and my answer is yes, except for the northwest and the northeast. So I don't. There are wonderful maps drawn by my wife in here that kind of take you throughout, but I don't get any really farther northwest than the Palisade Grand Junction area, and I know that I missed Dinosaur National Monument and some beautiful sites up there. And again, it was just a matter of numbers here where I had to cut it down. But if you could see the map, you would see that most of the state is covered in one way or another. Sadly, that's just one of those two areas that isn't.
There's part of your next book.
Exactly. No, and my next book I hope to be even more all-encompassing as to the state. Good. Well, anyone else? Oh, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, we just could make a comment. We driving through Del Norte, we did stop at Three Barrel and Brew. It was just really a fun place. And also to entice people more to go down there, we say they have a really neat restored old hotel in town. And then they have Penitente Canyon. We took a nice hike there, and people like to bike there. There was like, it was beautiful.
Yes, yeah, and see that's exactly what I'm talking about here. Like this is the only place in Del Norte that ended up in the book, but I hope that people who would go down there were to look around. And I mean, and just frankly, the entire San Luis Valley was the aha moment of this book to me. I don't think I had planned to put as much of it in this book until I went down there, and I went down to the town of San Luis, which is the oldest town in Colorado, founded in 1851. Hiked up the Way of the Cross to look over town, and said this has to be a part of the state's history. Or I went to Fort Garland, which I just thought, well, it's a fort, I'll check it out, and had no idea until I got down there how historically significant it was. That this is where the Second Colorado launched from when they won the Battle of Glorieta Pass, the westernmost battle of the Civil War, and this is where the Buffalo Soldiers were headquartered for a while. This is the last place that Kit Carson ever was an officer. And so, yeah, the San Luis Valley as a whole, Del Norte and around it, was the place that I was floored by and wish I could spend a lot more time in. Yes, sir.
I thought I heard you say that you learned to drink in one of these bars. Is it true that Colorado had that big an impact on you, or might you, with your passion, be exaggerating a bit?
I should say this. I learned to drink in Colorado in those bars. Now, I'm a guy who, even when I went to college, the local liquor store had a mix of six cooler of microbrews. This is in the early 1990s when there's only a limited number of them. And while everybody else was buying the 30 packs of Keystone, I was saving up my work study money and checking out these wild beers, the Honey Porter and the Stout and things like that were coming out. So I think it's safe to say I, like most people, learned to drink in college. But I really started my love of beer back outside of Northwestern University in Chicago. Just when I got to Colorado Springs, the place that I spent a lot of time in those early months was Bristol Brewing. It was kind of my first brewery home here in the state. And so that's what I should have said about that. Yes, sir.
Curious, you have any recommendations up in or around Breckenridge?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I'm only pausing because I didn't actually include anything in the town of Breckenridge in the book. I did other places in Summit County, but yeah, if you're going up to Breckenridge, Broken Compass Brewing is the place that I highly recommend stopping there. They're doing a killer coconut porter these days, and you know, my Summit County stops here include probably places that you know, like Lake Dillon, but I still find great peace in walking around Lake Dillon. In fact, actually, after my father died 6 years ago, I was at a conference up there and spent a lot of the conference, not in the conference, but walking around the lake, and it really drove home how much water, as much as we don't take it as being a big part of Colorado, makes this state what it is in some ways, because when you see a place like Lake Dillon, or you go down to Lake City and you see the lake down there, it puts in perspective how beautiful it is and how much natural resources vary in our state from place to place. Yes, ma'am.
So, is there a brewery you would recommend in Lake City?
Is there a brewery I would recommend in Lake City? The answer is there is not a brewery in Lake City. Lake City is a town of about 300 people at its height. And that was one of the tough parts about Lake City, is I knew that if I sent people there, I wasn't sending them anywhere else that day, because it's not near anything. And so the history was easy. There's a wonderful kind of back road jeep trail, if you will, or four-wheel drive trail that takes you some incredible waterfalls and an old desolated mill to go on for the natural site. For the drinking site, I have a place in town that's just called Packers Cannibal Grill, and I was quite surprised. They had a list of, let me make sure I'm not getting my numbers wrong in here. I think it was about 25 different whiskeys that they had on there. They had you know, just your regular craft beers that you might expect from the likes of New Belgium, Oscar Blues, and Odell. Yeah, here it is. The whiskey list runs 25 deep and is accompanied by a dozen tequilas and vodkas. So it actually is a good place to go and drink. And and as you'll see in the book, I have a picture of my dinner there, which was these wings that they said came with carrots, which were like 4 little things like this. It's completely meat-centric, as you would expect a place called Packers Cannibal Grill to be. So I had to give it props for that. Yes, sir.
Have you considered starting your own brewery?
I have not considered starting my own brewery, and I analogize it to barbecued ribs. You'll have to go with me there. In that I like to grill out and I like to cook out a lot, and I've never been able to make ribs by myself. I usually leave them so raw they're deadly. And I finally just gave up, and I said, you know what? Just because there's so many people that do this better than me, why would I, make my own? I'll just go out and enjoy them. That's kind of my attitude with brewing. I brew with friends every once in a while. I don't homebrew myself, and the reason is because why would I? There's so many great things out there. I'm going to go out and support breweries. I have a hard enough time keeping up with where the breweries are these days to be stuck in my own fridge. So that's why I like to support people more than tout my own beer. I will be back here signing my book. I'll be selling copies as well. With tax included, it's $23.75. I can take cash or credit cards. I have a Square. Love to talk with you more. Hang around. I want to hear your places that you love to go, because I'd like to find out where to go. And I had promised your state representative that if he came up here, because I cover the legislature, I was going out for a beer with him afterwards to Wibby, and he didn't show up. So I'll just throw it open then. Anybody who wants to come out afterwards, I'm going to head down to Wibby, and I'd love to continue the conversation down there. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks everyone for coming out. Don't forget we've got some great programs coming up. If you got a flyer, please get yourself signed up. We often do sell out. Thank you again.
I took a photograph.